and welcome to the Louisville Free Public Library, to the main library. Thank you all for being here with us. My name is Aaron Rosenblum. I'm a program coordinator here at the main library, and now I can talk about our guests a little bit. So, Alanna Nash is a recipient of the Country Music Association Media Achievement Award and the Charlie Lamb Award for Excellence in Country Music Journalism. She's the author of 7 books, including The Colonel, The Extraordinary Story of Colonel Tom Parker and Elvis Presley, Dolly, the Biography, and Elvis and the Memphis Mafia. She is from and lives here in Louisville, Kentucky, where she covered Elvis's funeral for the Courier-Journal. Her latest profile is of Shania Twain, and it's coming out in a national magazine in just a couple months. And by the way, we have some of her books and Will's, also the library's versions of their books on a shelf right out there. So if you have a library card, you can grab them on the way out and go check them out before you go home. Our other guest performs under his own name and is in the past as Palace Brothers, Palace Music, Bonnie Prince Billy, that's the current one. And he has released more than 20 acclaimed studio albums, along with EPs, singles, and music for film and television. He has appeared in the films of John Sayles, Kelly Reichardt, and others, and he's a longtime and lifelong, again, denizen of Louisville, Kentucky. And his new album, I Made a Place, is out tomorrow on Drag City Records, and we did not do that on purpose at all, and it's a real joy to have him here the day before his new record comes out. Please join me in welcoming Alanna Nash and Will Oldham.
Thank you.
What did you say? We were talking.
Wow, look at all these people. Thanks for coming. Goodness gracious, I didn't expect to have almost a full room, did you?
No. I've never spoken in one of these things before.
No, I do feel like a sportscaster now.
I feel like Madonna.
Need that bra, cone bra.
Yeah. So we're going to have a conversation, and you're going to listen in, and we're going to try to... Hi!
Where is she?
She's right there.
This is his daughter.
Yeah. Ah! And she can't tell where my voice is coming from.
It must be confusing. Daddy's up here, and she wants to get to him.
Yeah. So when did we meet?
Well, the first time
right.
we met, this is kind of a little bit of a long story, but in 2010, I had a milestone birthday, and I wanted to go back to one of my favorite places in the world, which is Jackson, Wyoming. Except I didn't have the money to go to Jackson, Wyoming for my birthday, so I thought, you've got a lot of stuff you've accumulated through the years. What can you sell that you really don't need anymore so you could go celebrate your birthday? So I looked around and went, aha! You know, when you write about music, or if you did write about music in the 70s and 80s and 90s, record companies were flush. They had money then, so they would send you these promotional T-shirts, and I kept them all. And so I had crates of T-shirts that I could no longer wear because I aged and got bustier and got fatter and all these T-shirts. But you know, some of them were pretty cool. But some of them I'd also bought out of a catalog, and I was never really sure if some of them were cool or not. Like I had one that said, "Show business is my life," you know, and I wasn't sure, you know, if I could pull that off with kind of a hip, jaded vibe, or if it was just really dorky and people were laughing when I passed by. So, but I took all these crates of T-shirts over to the Cherry Bomb on Bardstown Road, and the guy looked at me like, you know, he was being asked to receive stolen goods. Like, you know, where did you get all these things? And but anyway, he gave me a nice, pretty penny for them, and I was very happy and run off to Jackson and had my birthday. And so a few years later, Loretta Lynn was in town, and I went down to she was at the Palace. I went to pick up my will call tickets, and as I went in, I noticed this kind of tallish, thinnish, handsome gentleman kind of leaning against the wall, kind of looking at me a little bit, and a foot up against the wall, as I recall. He was really, you know, I wanted to look at him. He looked interesting. But you know, it was time to go get my tickets, and they said name, and I said Nash, and showed my driver's license, and started to leave with my tickets when that very interesting young man said, "Alanna Nash?" Why, yes. And he said, "I'm Will Oldham." I went, oh, wow, was really pleased to meet him. And he said, did you sell a bunch of T-shirts over at the Cherry Bomb not too long ago? I said, yeah, I did, a whole bunch of them. He said, well, I have one. I said, oh, really? I said, which one? He said, it's the Show Business is My Life T-shirt.
See her, she's clapping.
So then I thought, oh, damn, I should have kept that one. That must have been really cool. I just didn't realize it.
It looks great at bar classes, I tell you. When I'm moving, yeah. Shows off my pecs.
So that was the first time we met. And then you were getting ready to do a book.
Yeah.
And you did. And it's for sale out there, along with another one of his. And I heard from our mutual friend, Todd Brashear, that you would like to chat about bookmaking, so to speak.
And just chat, just knowing that, because she's a legend in the music world, and to know that she's not only from Louisville, but was still living in Louisville. I just thought, oh, well, if she's game to let me pick her brain, then I would love for that to happen.
And I was just honored that you would do that. So we got to know each other a little bit that way. But now we really have, just in the course of promoting this a little bit, we've gotten to spend time together. And gosh, I really feel like a kid in the candy store getting to know him.
It's so much fun. She's insanely complimentary, but also just, she's, unlike some of us, she's never really corrupted her brain with different kinds of mind-altering substances. And so she has pretty much every brain cell that she was born with. And each of those brain cells holds a wealth of incredible knowledge about music and music history, but it's then also filtered through a pretty strong humanity and like a sense of judgment and cause and effect that's always really fascinating to hear Alanna tell stories about what she's put her mind. She just this week we were talking about Patti Loveless. Patti Loveless is one of my biggest musical heroes as a singer, and I'm pretty happy in general to not know that much about people whose music that I'm interested in, primarily because most of the information we know is so incredibly distorted by one force or another that it's almost worthless to try to draw any conclusions from what you learn. So I never, and I figured Patti Loveless, where are you? She's somebody who came up in Nashville in the hit-making machinery, so what are you ever going to learn about her that's really interesting or true? And so I never bothered. And every time a new record would come out, I would hear all this emotion, and I knew her partner in life was her husband and producer, Emery Gordy Jr., and I just thought, how does she find, the desolation record after record when she's, seems to be incredibly talented, incredibly successful, incredibly stable and loved? And it wasn't really until Alanna this week brought me a Xerox copy of her 1991 article from Louisville Magazine, sort of a full biographical profile of Patti Loveless that I started to learn. And also to pine for time and space for somebody with a strong writer's voice to write about music and to have a place for that writing to be, and to know that there's an audience not only among us, this kind of audience, but an audience among publishers who respect and know that this kind of writing is appreciated and I think necessary for a healthy cultural environment. And just thinking like, wow, Louisville Magazine, really? Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Well, that's so nice of you. I appreciate that so much. I was really, really struck by Patti's work, and I loved it that she was a Kentuckian.
Yeah.
And like you, I heard that pain in her voice, and I wanted to know what the cause of it was. And she was so approachable, and her family lived here, and
She went to Fairdale High.
she was from the family moved to Louisville when she was little, and she settled in Fairdale. And they were all around. The family was all around. They were all very accessible and proud of her. And I just thought, let's get the local story.
Yeah.
Proud of that girl.
And was it? Did you like with somebody like Patty? Do you go to her management with credentials that are just your own accumulated credentials, or do you say, "I'm writing this for Louisville Magazine," and she immediately? Did you know her before writing the piece?
I knew Emery Gordy, her husband, Emery Gordy Jr. He uses the junior. He was one of the
briefly,
MCA
why
guys.
does he use the junior?
I was told that he uses the junior because senior had disappeared early in his life, and he was always hoping that senior would read his name and come look him up. It's very touching.
That's a good mate for Patty, I think. Yeah,
that's right. So Emery was attached to Tony Brown at MCA. Tony Brown was, a lot of people know him from his gospel days or his days of being Elvis Presley's piano player on the road and Elvis's last touring years. And then he was a record company executive. I think he started at RCA before he went over to head up MCA. And Emery was one of the kind of the young Turks that he brought on over there to help find the right talent and bring talent to the label. That
so
wasn't,
Emery is an A&R guy?
I think he was an A&R guy at the time. We're going back to the early 90s. And, but I remember I was, or the late 80s actually, because I was working on, here's a little plug for one of my books for sale out there. I was doing a book of conversations with 27 of the greats of country music. It's called Behind Closed Doors, Talking with the Legends of Country Music. Don't ask me why Charlie Rich isn't in the book, but that's another story. But I wanted to interview.
Is that a good story?
No, I
Okay.
just couldn't couldn't
wondering.
find him in time.
Yeah.
But it's odd to have 27 legends in the book, and it's named for a song by another one, but he's not in the book. But anyway, I very much wanted Bill Monroe, and Emery was, I think, producing Bill or somehow involved with Bill at the label. And so he set up my Bill Monroe interview. And so I got to know Emery sort of well. I liked him. He's a really nice guy. And one day he called me and he said, "I'm coming up to Louisville. I'm bringing this girl that I've signed, and we're just so really excited about her. Her name is Patty Loveless, and I'm going to overnight you a cassette of her first album, and I want to introduce you to her, and I think you'll really like her sound." So he did that, and I met them at KT's. Yep. And the record wasn't sequenced yet.
They're about to tear that building down to build some weird atrocity that people are supposed to be in support of. But
well, I wish I liked. No,
Yeah.
we're being recorded.
yeah,
But anyway, I met them there, and the odd thing is, by the time I loved it so much that I listened to it endlessly, and he was still kind of sequencing the record, and he couldn't decide on a couple things. And we sat there. The restaurant was closed, and we sat there, and they kind of kept it open for us a little bit longer. And we sequenced that album sitting in KT's, the three of us.
my big memories of KT's was that they had bottomless glasses of Coca-Cola, and so would always remember being driven home by my parents with the most explodingly full bladder, just drinking Coke after Coke after Coke after Coke.
Yes,
I
one
like yours
remembers
better.
those things.
I would rather have your memory of KT's than my memory of KT's.
I loved KT's. I was very sad when it closed.
In the article, I noticed that you said that Patty married a guy whose last name was Lovelace,
Yes.
and in the article, you sort of demurely said that she changed the spelling to Loveless because that was always how they pronounced it.
Right.
But I figured there was probably another reason why you would change your name as a woman from Lovelace away from Lovelace.
I don't think it was for the porn star.
You don't
I think
so?
It was
Like,
more.
I mean, wouldn't that be like? Yeah, I would imagine that would be, unless you were like married to David Allan Coe, that would not be a count for you in your professional career at that time.
I think it was for the Loveless Motel.
Ah,
Yeah.
that what it was named? Wait,
I think that was
that
the
she changed
association.
it to
Yeah.
the Loveless Motel.
Yeah.
yeah.
That was the association.
Yeah.
People knew that, and it rolled off the tongue easily, and those biscuits sure were good.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And she didn't. She sounded. I mean, the one time I saw her play in Louisville was at Headliners, which was a really strange place.
Yes, I remember that show.
And she seemed kind of sad or sour or just dark there. And I've seen her play a bunch of places, and that was the place where the performance was really great, really strong, and in this article it goes into that, she didn't really have strong positive memories of her time in Louisville, just lots of...
Maybe that's why she was kind of dark that night.
Yeah, because, you were describing in the article, I think, a Louisville area show, and she was not happy.
Yeah, that was probably it.
Yeah.
Speaking of albums, you have a new album out tomorrow.
Tomorrow, yeah.
I Have Made a Place.
Yeah. Which is a coincidence to this event. I think Aaron probably said that. But it is coming out tomorrow.
Yeah.
Circumstance sometimes works in our... Because we don't have a very elaborate promotion or publicity team where I work. And I think in 2006 a record came out back when release days were on Tuesday, and they called us a couple days before from the Conan O'Brien show and asked if we could fill in on that night. And so we put together a band, including Matt Sweeney, who's here. And it happened to be the night of the day that the record was coming out. So it looked like we had money and power and influence.
Yes.
But we were, never asked back.
I don't know how many people came mostly to see Will. I'd like to see it. Go ahead. It's all right. My ego won't be shattered. It's all right. Well, I don't think people in Louisville know really how well known he is and how highly, highly regarded he is by people in the know.
Well, I don't think people in Louisville, whenever I would say that I'm having this conversation with you, people would not know, who you are and that you live here and that you're from here. And I was just like, this is going to be so exciting to introduce Alanna to my fellow Louisvillians.
I mean, this is a fellow, there was a New Yorker profile done on him. Just on him.
This is a woman
Here
who
we go.
knows...
Here we go.
Who knows what we all wonder, which is, what is the deal with Dolly Parton and her husband Carl? She knows that.
Look, that gets applause. New Yorker doesn't get applause.
Yeah, see? That's what I'm saying. She has a very skewed sense of what's important in this world.
Lowbrow. It's embarrassing.
Yeah.
No, this guy is really, really like Marianne Faithfull. I mean, I'm so old. I remember when As Tears Go By came out, right?
I'll tell you, the really exciting thing about Marianne Faithfull was I have a song called A King at Night, and the refrain is, "This is how I start another day in my kingdom." And she did a royal command performance for the Prince of Monaco and sang that song.
And sang his song.
And that's pretty cool. I mean, that's cool, like roadside attraction cool.
So that's really cool. And then Broken English. So I go from As Tears Go By to Broken English, Marianne Faithfull. Like, whoa. Who's literally one of the coolest women in the world. And I'm buzzing through YouTube, and there she is, talking about meeting him in Dublin.
Well, I met her through Matt Sweeney, yeah.
And singing his song, and she says, this guy's the next Neil Young.
I tell you, another crazy Marianne Faithfull thing was after a show in London backstage, being in the dressing room in this narrow corridor while she and Anita Pallenberg, I'm standing there while they're doing up each other's corsets, and I'm just standing there just like, whoa, this is amazing.
I mean, his story is really, I could just sit at his feet and listen to him all night. I mean, he is, and if you don't know his music, please learn it. You could even go to Spotify and hear 20 cuts, right? Your favorites?
You can now, yeah.
Yep.
I was wondering, the last time that we had sat down before preparation for this event, I was curious what Alanna was up to at the time, and at the time she was in talks to potentially be the ghostwriter for Lita Ford's autobiography. Mm-hmm. And I noticed at the Locust Grove book sale recently, the Lita Ford autobiography was there, and Alanna's name was nowhere to be seen. So I thought, that didn't happen. I was wondering what you'd been up to, and so I asked, and on Monday when we met, and so Alanna's been writing not something about music or the music business. She's writing for the first time something that's a personal story. That's she describes it as a memoir, although the more that you described it, the more I realize you are keeping yourself out of it as you write a portrait of a close friend.
Right. Just to go back to Lita Ford for a second, though. You know, a lot of these metal stars or rock and roll stars who are getting a little age on them run out of money, so they think, oh, I can write an autobiography. And then they get a publisher.
Hillary Clinton, Lita Ford.
Everybody.
Yeah, everybody.
Yeah, everybody.
Basically
really.
all of them.
Yeah, everybody. So some of them actually do write them, but very few of them write them. So they go looking for people like me who will write them, interview them at great length, and then try to get their voice on the page, and then write their story for them. And you get a little credit in the acknowledgments. If you're lucky, you get a little credit in the acknowledgments. But some of this generation of music stars have run into a little difficulty when they go to write these books, which is they can't remember their life. And that was the case with Lita Ford. I think I was writer number 5, and I think there were at least 5 after me. You'd spend a lot of time talking to her, and just, I kind of have a story about that, but I'm not really sure if it's true.
Yeah.
I think, and the stories she did have, they just weren't meaty enough to really fly with the publisher. So then you'd go back and you'd just go back, and then finally you'd say, I give up. And a lot of people gave up, and that book almost didn't come out. But.
And Alanna does a fair amount of credited and uncredited ghostwriting or assisting
Right.
people writing their life story, and which also makes her a wonderful person to speak with, because she has the integrity and the respect for privacy to maybe not tell all of you some of the stories she knows, but in a private conversation, she's a little bit looser, and it can make the conversation pretty fun.
Bill and Brenda know.
Yeah.
Yeah.
She said this morning, she was like, is this going to be recorded? Oh, then I guess
Right,
I
I
can't
have to
tell that
have.
story about,
That's right.
yeah.
Yeah. Well, a little shop talk.
Yeah.
But I am writing a memoir. Thank you for bringing that up.
Well, it's a fascinating story.
Well, thank you. It's a story about my closest friend, whose name is Elizabeth Clifford, who was just an absolute star. She was from Evansville, not a music star, but a writing star. She was editor of her high school paper and wrote a lot of comedic things. But other than that, she was just a very bright light. She had a natural flair for comedy, and was academically bright. And one of her friends, she went to Randolph-Macon Women's College, and one of her friends said, Elizabeth was the most alive person on that campus. But when I met Elizabeth 18 years ago, she was in trouble. She had been brought up by a middle-class family in Evansville, and a family that was very well regarded and still well regarded. But her mother was very abusive, not physically, but mostly emotionally and verbally abusive. And at the age of 9, Elizabeth started having panic attacks. And as with a lot of...
It's a good cue for Poppy.
Yes, Poppy's deciding maybe the story's too long, but...
She was having a panic. She was doing a Foley sound. It was a panic
Right.
attack, yeah.
And Elizabeth was self-medicating when I met her in 2001, and alcohol, but mostly pills. And she'd been drinking since college and doing pills since she was in her 30s, and she was, by that time, 44. And she was such a quality person, working on her PhD, and she was blacking out every night. And she was waking up in the shower, say, and couldn't remember how she ended up in the bottom of the tub with water falling down on her, or finding the furniture overturned and having no memory of how it got that way. And so I just thought, gosh, she needs help. Somebody's got to help her. And I tried to recruit some of her friends to do that, and nobody seemed to be stepping up. And I thought, well, I've got to do this. This is what my father always taught me. You see somebody in need, you try to help. And she was just, wonderful and funny and smart and just a joy to be around, and life of the party, and just a great, loyal, faithful person. And so I decided I was going to try to help her, and I, with the family's consent and financial backing, I guided her through 5 rehabs in 3 different states, and she just became a huge part of my life, except when her family moved her to Louisville from Virginia, where she was living. I was pretty nervous about that because by this time her addiction was just way, way, way out of control. And then she moved here in 2011, and from 2011 until 2017, she was in the Brook 9 times, and she was in the Baptist Psych Unit about 5 times, I think.
And Alanna, would you pause and tell, just to put some music back in, about your encounter with Keith Urban?
Oh, well, you know, sometimes when you do these interviews with people, and sometimes you just drop little things about yourself into the conversation as a way to identify with what they're saying, or as a way to keep the conversation moving. And oftentimes, the most amazing things happen when you do that. And Keith had been in rehab in Tennessee, in one of the rehabs Elizabeth was in, and I mentioned this to him, and he asked me her name, and I told him, and he said, "I'll pray for Elizabeth." And I thanked him, and I thought he meant he would pray for her later. And he dropped to his knees and prayed for her. Well, I kept saying to Elizabeth, you know, one of these days I'm going to walk into this apartment of yours and I'm going to find you dead, Elizabeth. You know, you've just got to try to not abuse yourself. You've just got to try. I must have said it 100 times. One of these days I'm going to walk in here and find you dead. Please don't do that to me. And on September 1st, 2017, that's exactly what happened. And
it took you a while.
it's taken a while.
Yeah, it's taken a while. I mean, it took a physical toll immediately, and kept you from exploring things to write about for
Yeah, I really didn't work for about a year and a half.
Yeah.
Yeah. You know, you always ask, what else could you have done? And sometimes you have to realize there wasn't anything to be done. Sometimes somebody is just too broken to be fixed. So I decided that I needed to write about, you know, addiction was a byproduct of mental illness, which was a byproduct of abuse. And I started thinking about her mother, and I started thinking about how different her life would have been if she'd had a healthy relationship with her mother. And so I applied for a grant from the Kentucky Foundation for Women about that very thing. So, you know, these aren't large grants, but I was so grateful for it. And it's all going to my friend Rebecca White here, who's doing all these transcription of all these interviews that I'm doing with Elizabeth's friends and family. But it's a huge task. I've never written a memoir, and I'm not sure I know how to write a memoir, but...
You say you have 900 pages?
I have 900 typewritten pages of notes.
Notes, wow.
So it's going to be tough to actually write the book, but that's my next project, yeah.
And do you see getting back into music writing once this project has you know, reached some sort of completion?
If music writing is still around.
Yeah, such a good question.
Yeah, but I do all kinds of other writing, but most people know me if they know me at all, for music writing, but yeah.
And you love music writing.
Oh, I do, yeah.
Your first piece was a music-based piece?
Well, I was a musician, not a good musician. But
you grew up in St. Matthews.
I grew up in, off of Brownsboro Road in the Reed Lawn subdivision.
Oh, right.
And then my parents moved to, we lived there from the time I was 5 until we moved to Alta Vista Road, Halloween, when I had just turned 13. And I still have my parents' house there.
You were Atherton?
And I went to Atherton.
Like my father,
I went to
my
Barrett.
wife, yeah.
Yeah, right. Went to Barrett, where I had just a diehard crush on a young fellow named Alan Reichel, who had a little folk music trio with a gal named Cardi Bledsoe and a fellow named Jim Thompson, who had an older brother named Hunter. Mm-hmm. And another brother named Davidson. But Hunter was the interesting one because Hunter was a writer, and I thought, you know, if this music stuff doesn't work out, I think I'm going to try this writing.
Right.
Yeah. I like pairing those two things, you know. So Jim and I were friends, but it was Alan that I really just, you know, made a young girl's heart aflutter. And they opened for Peter, Paul, and Mary at Freedom Hall I think 1964, and I thought that was pretty impressive for 15-year-old kids.
Yeah.
And so I was hoping that Alan would take more of an interest in me, you might say. And so I decided I would write a story about these 15-year-old kids who, were so great. And I sat in my parents' basement and wrote about the Cellar Singers, that was their name, and mailed it off to 17 Magazine. And one day the phone rang, and 17 Magazine was ready to publish my piece.
And I figured to ask, because you've contributed a lot to Rolling Stone over the years.
Lots of magazines, yeah.
And I thought, oh, well, of course, she's going to have some sort of crossover story with Hunter Thompson that people would be interested in hearing about, or that I might be interested in hearing about. And I thought it was going to be something that I actually wasn't interested in hearing about, because I'm actually not that interested. I'm, one of the few Louisvillians who's actually not that interested in Hunter Thompson. But then, of course, she surprised me this morning with a pretty great Hunter Thompson story.
Oh, it's not that good.
It's a great story.
Well, it's
just
kind of a family story in that...
it's not huge. It's not that kind of a great story, but
right. Well, it's really more the family. Their mother, Virginia, worked upstairs. And when I was in high school, and I had another friend from school whose mother worked upstairs. And, you just come down and see Mrs. Thompson and Mrs. Williams. But Jim liked R&B music. And I didn't know much about R&B, so he would take me down to Vine Records, when Vine Records here at the corner, it was Preston, wasn't it? It was Preston and Broadway,
Anybody remember where Vine was?
Preston, yeah.
Preston?
And they had the listening booths, where you could take a record in and put it on the turntable and listen with headphones. And I think it was the only place in Louisville. It was the only place in Louisville I knew where you could do that. And so Jim would take me down there and we'd listen to R&B. He would school me about R&B. And one day we did that, and then we went back to his house on Ransdell, and he got the mail, and there was a big reel. When we had reel-to-reel tapes, audio, and Hunter, instead of writing letters, would send audio letters. He'd just talk on tape and mail it home. And I thought, wow, that's really cool. And so he was embedded with Hell's Angels.
Right.
And Jim let me listen to some of that.
So he was just sort of explaining what he was doing as writing that book.
Right. So Jim was telling me that, his brother was a real writer, and I thought, wow,
that's interesting. You don't need a longer story about Hunter Thompson. That's good enough, right? The rest of it's all mumbling.
Now that I'm getting to know you a little bit, and I'm just enjoying this friendship so much.
Me too.
I'm so grateful to Aaron for putting this event together, and also grateful to so many of you who have come to this. Thank you so much.
Grateful to the library.
Very grateful to the library. And you're very easy to speak with and very accessible, and I've enjoyed you. But in preparation, the only way I can do the work I do is to read, listen. And so much of the press that was done on you, there's this whole, you don't seem very accessible at all, like you hate doing press. And here you are, just this very friendly fellow. So I have to ask about this mystique around you, and particularly about maybe not liking the press. I'm getting a scowl now. I'm in trouble. But I'm curious if you sort of invited the mystique around you in the sense of helped build it, or did it just come up organically out of the music?
Well, I don't really, if you've noticed tonight, I don't really like to talk about myself all that much.
I have noticed this.
So interviews are really awkward and unpleasant situations. And then if, on top of that, the person I'm talking to isn't all that fun to talk to or that interesting, then you're really up S-H-I-T creek without a paddle. Yeah, so you're enjoying it because I love hearing everything that you say. So it's fun to talk to you because you're just fun to talk to and fun to listen to. And
well, thank you.
But I don't. Yeah,
don't ask
but
any
those
more
other
questions, right?
But those other all those situations, especially like right now, there's this record coming out, and I've tried to do some interviews, and it's really hard. It's almost. It's really upsetting actually, and I get a little. I feel a little emotionally and otherwise crippled by the process, and then eventually I always have to say I can't do anymore,
Mm-hmm.
because it's just so mindless. And then now when you end up seeing the end product, it's so uninteresting to read because the writing is so minimal and efficient, and
I think one reason that the writing is minimal is because there are so few places where you really are allowed space to write. I mean, the internet is the size of infinity, I guess, but you still have to write basically short pieces unless it's a very specific kind of site. But because the attention span, thanks to USA Today, I think we used to call McPaper, like McDonald's.
Yeah.
Our attention span is such as humans that people don't want to read long-form pieces anymore. So,
Right.
which is a shame.
Yeah, so there's the idea that anything that comes out that's especially now when a piece comes out and it's going to be a resource for people like yourself in preparation for this. If somebody's curious about the music, they're going to look on the internet and something is going to last from today until things crumble and melt.
Right.
And you just think, oh my goodness, this better be something that's interesting to read because it's going to be associated with this music that I feel so much about and we put so much work into. You don't want the music sitting side by side with a terrible piece of writing, and that's something that we don't really have much say in right now. You're pretty much bound to have your music associated with terrible pieces of writing.
Well, I do have one question about this album. I very much enjoyed the video for In Good Faith, which is such a beautiful song.
Yeah, thank you.
But it's not actually on the CD that you gave me.
Right.
Why is that?
Well, because we were trying to I'm trying to game the streaming system a little bit by putting out two strong singles that aren't ultimately on the record. And that way, when the record comes out tomorrow, people won't have heard anything from the record, and they can experience the record for the first time from beginning to end, as opposed to with these sort of attention interrupters that a pre-release single might bring into the experience of listening to the record from beginning to end. And yet we did want to use everything that the streaming services had to offer to us, which is not really very much. They're not very kind or generous with the way that they release and distribute the music. And yeah, that's the short answer. Yeah. It's
such a beautiful song, and that came out of thinking about shape note music, right?
Well, the song came out of actually another. I have so many Sweeney connections, but he introduced me to a friend who is a songwriter and music producer named his name's Blake. What's Blake's last name? Blake Mills. And Blake had we'd done something for this John Legend record a couple years ago. He asked me to write songs for that or contribute to songwriting on that, and then he said, "Oh, I'm going to be making a record for Mavis Staples." I think it was Mavis Staples, and he said, "If you've got anything for Mavis Staples," and so I said I can put something together maybe for Mavis Staples, and I started writing that song. And the instigation was someone had claimed to be doing something in absolute good faith, and I had completely rained on his parade, and I thought, well, it's an interesting juxtaposition there, to do something in good faith and then to complain about the result. I think Christianity wouldn't exist if that was, what people did, right? I mean, you do everything in faith, and if you're not satisfied with the results, I think that religion would have died out years ago. But then Blake never got around to making that record, and then he called again and said, "Oh, they want me to do an Emmylou Harris record. You got anything for that?" So I was like, "Well, that song might work." And so I reworked it a little bit, and then that never happened. And then I was making this record, and I thought, well, there's a song, I can rework it again, and maybe Bonnie Prince Billy can sing it. And then Timothy Morton, who had made the video for our song Blueberry Jam last summer, and we'd had such a great time making that video, and he's a leader, sort of a long-time contributor to the shape note music community in this country, and people know him all over the country, and really all over the world they know his name. I said, I have this idea for a music video for this song In Good Faith. He said, well, do you have any ideas? I said, well, I have this idea where, well, anyway, what are you working on? And he said that he was working on this documentary about shape note singing, in which he really wanted to illustrate how different all the participants in modern day shape note singing are. And like they come from all walks of life and all different ages and all different occupations. And so his documentary was sort of focused around showing all these different paths leading to this one musical force. And I said, well, that's funny because the idea that I had, and maybe you'll want to, flesh this out, was to, have people preparing for an event, and it could be old, young, all different, races, religions, preparing for an event separately throughout the course of the song, and at the end, they show up on a stage, and they're together to do something, and then the song ends, and that's the whole end of the story. And so it doesn't matter what they were there together to do. And then we talked about it, and I said, well, I don't know if you would feel good about this or bad about this, but what if you instead, rather than we waste time casting and putting something together, would it help serve your purposes in the life of this film to use your footage and have this song be the soundtrack to some of that footage? And he asked all the participants, and they said okay, and he put together this totally amazing, which is actually showing tonight at the Speed in a short film slam.
Rocks are buried beneath tons of earth to become diamonds. With the gift of the sunlight, the kudzu vine goes climbing. Instruments play songs brought forth from the minds of their makers. These vibrations resound, bringing union and joy to all takers. We open our eyes to a parade of first mornings breaking. We pray what we see and we hear might be ours for the taking. We rise every day and we will till our golden star bursts. We open our hearts and say, Lord, do your best, do your worst. Place our hands on the faces of our mothers. We do what we can to strike fear from the hearts of our brothers. In good faith, in good faith, in good faith, in good faith.
Yeah, I love that Sacred Heart singing. Of course, I've done that all my life, ever since I was a little old kid.
Yeah. But yeah, so I mean, I did a solo show in London a year or two ago, and the opening act, and it was in a chapel, and the opening act was the London Shape Note singing community, and it was, it was like getting to be here with you. It's like a good thing, good reason to do what I do. Is to find yourself able to be at the right place in the right time. In a way that other people don't necessarily get to be.
Right.
Because it's cool, if you don't know the Shape Note tradition, it's alive in a really wild and wonderful and interesting way right now, and completely accessible to anybody, and you just have to look for a singing in town, which there are with fair regularity, and it's something incredible to experience.
My grandparents, the Nash side of the family, were Mormon. And when my father was 17, he went to his father, who was devoutly Mormon, and he said, this thing about Joseph Smith and the tablets, I don't think so. And my grandfather showed him the highway.
Oh, yeah.
It took a long time for them to reconcile, but he sang from the Shape Note tradition. And I remember that's the first time I heard about Shape Note from my grandfather Nash. Yeah. Not to be confused with snake handling, right?
No, although I imagine there's probably a little bit of crossover here and there.
Yeah. We were talking a little bit about country music, and you're the only guy I know who not only had a song cut by Johnny Cash, but also got to sing backing vocals.
Yeah, that was, one of the wildest days of my life, for sure.
The song is I See a Darkness.
Mm-hmm.
This is one of the Rick Rubin recordings.
Yeah.
Will you tell us that story?
Yeah, have you heard me tell this story before?
No.
Really?
No.
Okay. Because I feel like, it's like, this is one thing that I actually wanted to talk to you about, and we talked about it a little, was the idea of the experience of being out there or up here, but looking at music magazines and music stories and looking at public personas of artists and thinking that we're being told the truth always about the artist, and then understanding as you grow older that most of the time you weren't told the truth about the artist.
Right.
But also feeling like, when someone tells a story, they tell it, oftentimes the most engaging stories, they're told with a degree of freshness, and you think like, oh wow, this story, nobody's ever told this story before, and then you realize that a really good storyteller has told that story hundreds of times. And I've always been on the fence about, well, do you want to be somebody who has a story that you tell again and again, or do you want to always have a new story so that that you're perfecting the ability to tell a new story, and you're never pulling the wool over anybody's eyes? So, in the interest of not pulling the wool over anybody's eyes, I've told this story many times. But it's a really good story.
I'm sure you're asked about it a lot.
Yeah. So it was cool. Like, I think, once again, Sweeney had said, I think he ran into somebody in New York City who said that he was just maybe with Rick Rubin, and they were listening to a bunch of, like, Bonnie Prince Billy records or something. And then maybe looking for Cash songs. And then I think he saw Rick Rubin at some sort of music function and said, hi, my name's Matt Sweeney, and I work with Will sometimes, and I heard you were listening to these things. And yeah, in fact, Johnny just cut a demo of I See a Darkness, and Matt called and said, that this had happened. And, that's exciting enough. End of story, right? Good, that was great. But then we had a show coming up in New York, and we played the show, and Matt invited Rick to come to the show at the Bowery Ballroom. And afterwards, he came up and said, I think we're going to record that song. Or actually, we've recorded some of it, and we want to do more. And it would be really cool if you came out and played the piano on the song, as a guest musician. Was that something you'd be interested in doing? I said, absolutely. Yeah, I would love to do that. That would be amazing. Yeah, absolutely. I would just, so here's my number. And he said, here's my number. So it took me about 2 days before I had the courage to call him and say, I left a message. And I said, "Hi, Rick, this is Will Oldham, and I have to say I have no idea how to play the piano." Because my friend Colin Gagan had played the piano on the record that we've made of it. I said, and I understand that could be the deal breaker, but if there's any way in the course of anything that happens, and I don't have any expectations, but if there's any way that I could show up sometime and be in the room with Johnny and June Carter Cash, if possible, that would be a dream come true and just be a fly on the wall, and if that can happen, and if not, that's fine. And he called the next day and said, "Well, we're having a session out in California in 3 weeks. It's on this date, on a Sunday. Why don't you just come to the session? It'd be fine. You can come to the session." Okay. So I used my Southwest points and flew out there, got there on a Sunday morning, and started calling his house, and it just rings. And I don't have a cell phone, so I'm pulling over, every half mile in my rental car, pulling out change and throwing it in the payphone. I'm like, "Hello?" And it rings. And I was like, this was a bad idea. Like, why did I think this was going to work out? I flew to California. What a sucker. And then finally at like 2 p.m, a woman answers and she says, "Oh yeah, Rick's just getting up, and I think, Johnny's about to arrive, and so you should just come over, here's the address." So I went over, and as soon as I got there and rang the doorbell, I could hear Johnny Cash's voice coming through the loudspeakers. And Rick was just coming down from upstairs, and he's in his pajamas, which I think is just what he wears 24/7. And he invited Johnny Cash to come up and said, "Johnny, this is Will Oldham." And I said, "Hello, Mr. Cash." And he said, "Please don't call me Mr. Cash. You can call me JR, you can call me John, or you can call me Johnny." And Rick said, Will wrote that song, "I See a Darkness." And he said, "Why don't we go work on that song then?" It's like, all right. So we went downstairs, and they said, they claimed, and they played it for me. And, they called in someone to pick up shards of my skull from the ceiling of the recording studio. And once they gotten all that cleaned up, they told me that they weren't, nobody was really happy with the vocal yet. And that Johnny couldn't quite get the timing the way he wanted it. And they asked if I would do a guide vocal. So I did a guide vocal over Randy Scruggs' guitar part. Randy Scruggs wasn't there. They were recorded, I think, in Hendersonville at Johnny Cash's house. And they pulled up his old scratch vocal and my voice and commented that the voices sounded good together. And then Johnny tried to sing the song again, and he still wasn't happy with the experience. So then it was suggested that I go and sit like this, with him in the recording studio and conduct his performance. So he got out his Singer's Saving Grace, which is a little spray that's good for your throat, and he sprayed it, and he looked at me with sort of a, impish, devilish grin and said, "It's the only way I get any alcohol these days." And then we began the song, and it begins very, very, slowly, the opening chords, and I'm sitting there, and Johnny Cash is just looking at me, and I'm go, "Now," and he sings the first line, and then the next line, and again, just so throughout the song, I'm sitting there, telling him when to come in on the song, and then at the end of the performance. Then we decide that I would, go back in and sing harmonies on the chorus with him, and then I think they added a couple more things. We were done, and then June showed up. It was lunchtime, and sat there on the couch with me, which I could, yeah, it was, and she said, when we were down in Jamaica, and Rick had sent us a cassette with your song on it, and when the song finished, I just turned to John and I said, "John, you have got to record this song." Which, yeah, again, like I'm not sure I've ever heard nicer things said about, or better things said about anything that I've been involved with professionally. And then got to watch them do That Lucky Old Sun from beginning to end and talk about, where Johnny Cash had learned the song, why he wanted to do it, and watch him and Benmont Tench and, just make magic and make music. And just, spend time with this man who I was positive would be lesser for one reason or another than one's expectations of him, could be. Because he's a star, because he's older and, I'd heard for years, infirm, and indeed he had energy to work for 3 or 4 hours and not more, but I'm not sure I've ever been in the room with somebody more present than those 3 or 4 hours in which he was listening to everybody and paying attention to everything and so engaged musically, and there was nothing more important than the music that was happening. And it's fun to relive that story, so I don't mind.
You told it well.
Yeah. Thanks.
He was as big as a mountain. He was
He was huge.
Big guy, big man. And of course, then there was an even bigger presence.
Yeah.
I interviewed him.
You can't prepare yourself for
You
it.
can't. There are only a few people left like that. I mean that generation of star.
Yeah.
And they really were stars. I mean, you look at kind of the current crop of people today. They're all proficient singers, and
They may even have MBAs.
Yes. Whereas when I first started going to Nashville in 1975, it was still like the Judds and Eddie Rabbitt could walk in off the street and get an audition.
Yeah.
And now nobody goes to Nashville without a degree, a lawyer.
Yeah.
It's a whole other thing. But they were that last of generation. Well, I'm thinking also of Ernest Tubb, people like Ernest Tubb, stars in the 40s especially, where the country music audience regarded the stars as kind of what the film critic Pauline Kael used to say after the film Nashville. She said that country music stars were symbolic, ordinary people. And in the 40s, with the fans of, say, Ernest Tubb, the fans would think of those people as family.
Yeah.
And literally invite them to come to their house for Sunday supper. And they would do it. Mm-hmm. They would go. And real friendships were formed, so that often when a performer went back through a certain little town, he would look up these people. This is the same with the very young Elvis Presley. And Johnny and June were about the last of that generation of people who would really regard the fans as family and turn over, literally turn over their house to them, in the sense that, just a little story. Whoops, I'm not used to this thing. I did a phone interview with June when her last album came out, and she was having a listening party for it at the house in a few weeks, and so she invited me to come down. I remember we finished the interview. This is so typical of this generation of Nashville stars. I mean, you wouldn't see Luke Combs doing this today, I don't think, or Casey Musgraves, maybe, but I don't think so. I mean, first of all, the security, you just can't do it. But we finished our phone interview, and June said, we're friends. And so she invited me to the listening party, and I went. And it was in a tent at their home in Hendersonville, which has since burned down. One of the Bee Gees bought it, and the damn place burned down when it was being rewired. It's really a shame. So I went, I got on the grounds, and found the publicist, and took me over and introduced me to June, and got a nice warm hug from her. And, I'm so glad you could come. And, this is the last, the people who really would say that and mean it, they did. And then she said, well, I want you to come out and hear everything. She said, but now, you haven't been through the house, have you? I said, no, I've never been in the house. Now, she said, well, I just go on through, take a little tour. And now John's up there doing an interview in one of the bedrooms, so if he comes out, you just tell him I sent you through the house. I'm like, holy moly. All their private possessions are just out, and the house was so extraordinary. It was built like a ship. There weren't stairs, there were ramps that got you from one level to the next. And June was quite a collector of esoteric and unusual things. So there was this one side of her that would collect all these things that maybe other people wouldn't want. And then there was this other side of her that was just so down to earth. She was having, she would have fur parties like people would have Tupperware parties. She was just great. I mean, they were both just really, really great. But so here I am wandering through the house, feeling very intrusive, but and I get up to the ramp, and just as I'm turning the corner, the bedroom door opens, and here stands the legendary, the man in black, J.R. Cash.
Yeah.
And so, in a little squeaky high voice, I stick out my hand and introduce myself and remind him of some ancient phone interview we had done and tell him that June had sent me through. And he was not well, and he was perspiring quite heavily. And he came out to the party, the listening party, and he stayed just a few minutes, and then he left. And it wasn't all that long that he left us. Well, she left first. Yeah. And I think most people weren't expecting that. Right. But everybody said he won't last long, and he sure didn't, just a matter of months, right?
I'm an old guy, and I've been hanging around the music business for a long, long time. And I feel like I try to be positive in every way I can, but it's really difficult. I felt like you all had alluded to the changes in the music business. Can you talk a little bit about it? I mean, I feel like corporate greed is killing the business.
It seems like, corporate greed takes every opportunity it can to push the consumer away from the actual experience of engaging with anything, because there's money to be made in between the thing and the person. That said, and there's a lot more people in the world, every day. So I think there are probably, it's heartening to know that every single day there are as many people like yourself who are rewarded by experiences that you may feel are less common now than they have been in the past. I think it's probably true that they're somewhat less common, but I think they are everywhere. It feels like they're gone because people are always talking about these other experiences that just don't sound half as interesting or half as rewarding or half as fun. And that's the noise it's the noise pollution that we have to deal with on a daily basis. But I think the music is happening all the time and all around us here in Louisville. Like, great music is happening, and people are talking about great music and having great musical experiences. You just wouldn't know it if you turn your computer on and think that the things that are being reported on and the way that they're being reported is the truth and is like the overarching truth about the state of music or culture right now.
What I hate seeing in Nashville is, of course, what's happened on Music Row, or what made the music business so special down there. It was just done in a kind of down-home folks way. All those little houses on 16th and 17th, and 18th and 19th down there were occupied by people in the music business as offices of producers or managers or publishing companies. And now so many of those have been torn down to build these big corporate headquarters for various parts of the music business. And it affects people psychologically. It's just not Nashville anymore.
There are 45s and LPs and CDs and cassette tapes that are still being manufactured and produced all around the country or the world. But yeah, the way that payment is getting to the people responsible for the creation of the content is changing significantly.
We were talking about streaming. That's why, in good faith, you held that back for streaming, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, so we could put out a physical record, yeah. And yeah, but use them, yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Let's get it, yeah.
I'm on? Yep. Thanks for your talk, first of all. 2 questions. I'm curious if that's a nudie jacket.
It's not.
Well, I love your outfit.
I couldn't
love your
afford that.
outfit,
Thank
too.
you. I do have sparkling music notes going all across, though. So.
Yes, very cool.
Thank you.
Very cool. But I wanted to elaborate a little bit on this gentleman's comment especially about country music. I have a very love-hate relationship with country music. I moved there. My family and I lived in Nashville from 95 to 2005. So when we first got there was when Garth Brooks and Shania Twain and all that was exploding everywhere. And the labels were still pretty flush with cash and arrogant. And then Napster happened. And instead of embracing that, they fought it. And then they lost control of that. And they've been kind of reeling ever since. My question is, the massive success of artists like Chris Stapleton, Sturgill Simpson, Tyler Childers, who are kind of doing the finger salute to Music Row and kind of doing it without them. And Sturgill and Tyler, I think, just announced an arena tour that they're probably going to fill arenas around the country. My understanding is...
They're playing the Yum Center.
Yeah. In fact, that's the wrap-up of the tour is there, which I love their music. And Casey Musgraves seems to be kind of the real deal. I guess my question is, do you think that there's a chance that real country music could become a commercial radio power again without the drunk horses and tractor songs that are out there now? Do you think Music Row's capable of getting it, or do you think they're going to continue to ignore it?
Well, I guess that depends on what your definition of real country music is. Versus, say, look at Luke Combs. Did you watch the CMAs last night, for example? Yeah, the CMA Awards last night. Well, there's a guy named Luke Combs who's kind of Garth Brooks-ish in size and appeal. And just when you think bro country is dead and gone, Luke Combs has tied Shania's record for an album, the longest chart-topping album in country history. He's a good old boy. Now, some people would call that authentic country music. But if you're talking about Chris Stapleton, Chris is always on the CMA Awards. So he is embraced by Nashville. And you don't get on the CMA Awards usually unless you're selling a lot of records. In fact, when Entertainment Weekly, the magazine, started up, I was the country reviewer. There was a jazz reviewer, a classical reviewer, a rock and roll reviewer, and a country reviewer, and I was the country reviewer. And I did a story for them about how the award shows pick the winners. And I think everybody who paid any attention figured out that those award shows were the people who performed on them and who got the awards were people who were selling massive amounts of records. I think people didn't realize about Nashville that Nashville engaged in just the same kind of block voting techniques as, say, the Motion Picture Academy did, where one label had, say, MCA, we're talking about labels that aren't in existence anymore, as I'm calling them. MCA might have a gal up for a female vocalist of the year, and RCA may need some votes for what we used to call the Horizon Award for the newcomer. So the MCA people would throw their votes over to that artist that RCA needed stuff for, and vice versa. So even though the so-called weekend warriors, or people who lived outside of Nashville, who belonged to the Country Music Association, could vote as long as they had their dues paid up, those votes really didn't. I shouldn't say don't count, but their votes were kind of slammed against them because these big blocks of votes were being exchanged so that these stars could be named the winners as building blocks in their careers for selling even more records. So anybody who's on that show, and that includes Chris Stapleton, who's been on quite a few years in a row now, is either selling records or they think is going to sell massive amounts of records. So he is a bright spot and somebody who is performing what you and I would probably consider authentic country music, but is able somehow to bridge the divide with commercial music as well. So but on the whole, I don't think it's going to happen. I mean, we were talking about Tony Brown and Emory Gordy Jr. When Tony went over to MCA, and that's when he signed Lyle Lovett and Nancy Griffith, some of the Texas artists who were on smaller regional labels, but not on mainstream record labels. And that was a big experiment of his to see if, you know, most folks who listen to country radio would embrace those kind of fringy artists. And you know, maybe for a while, because there was a lot of buzz and a lot of hype by people like me who would write, you know, telling people who listen to country radio, yeah, but listen to Nancy Griffith. You know. And that really, there weren't those massive amounts of record sales. And so the experiment failed. That's right. That's right. Yeah. Aaron, are you picking the folks or?
Hi. You mentioned in the introduction that Will had been in a Kelly Reichardt film, so I want to ask a film question, if that's okay. So I love Old Joy. I love Kelly Reichardt films. And I was thinking as you were talking about the kind of conversation focus in that film, but what I really enjoy about it is your physicality in it. And that also ties in with one of my other favorites, which is Jackass. And I just wondered if you had any stories about either of those experiences, and you know, you don't have to focus on that aspect of it, but that's something. I love Jackass, so you know, either
Right.
one of the Kelly Reichardt and Jackass.
So asking about movies that I've been in, including one called Old Joy, and then Jackass 3D.
Yes.
And again, I'll just tell a quick Jackass story, just because I have one. And that was that my dad went to see the first Jackass with his friend Bill Schreiber, and he came home and he was distraught, and he said, "I just saw the worst movie." I was like, "Really? What was it?" He said, "Jackass." I said, "Really? It wasn't good?" He said, "No, it was awful. It was just awful. It was pathetic." And I said, "Well, tell me about it." And he started to tell me about it, and as he described each scene, he would inevitably begin to break down in laughter until he couldn't finish telling the story of each scene. And after about 10 minutes, I said, "Sounds like that was a pretty great movie." And he said, "You know, I think it was a pretty great movie." And then, for many reasons, regretfully, my dad wasn't around for the second movie to come out. And the second movie came out, and his friend Bill Schreiber called and said, "Hey, for Joe, you want to go see this Jackass movie with me?" So we went to see Jackass 2 together. And then there's a guy, music documentary filmmaker named Lance Bangs, who works on the Jackass movies, usually shooting DVD extra footage and second unit footage. And he also made a documentary about the Louisville band Slint. And he was in town beginning work on the documentary about Slint, and I asked him what he was up to, and he said, "Oh, we're, making another Jackass movie." And I said, "Really? Can I be in it?" And he said, "You want to be in it?" I was like, "Yeah, I do. I really do." And he said, "Well, I don't know. I'll see what I can do." And I said, "Well, what could I do to be in it?" And he said, "Well, could you write a theme song?" I said, "For the movie?" He said, "No, for my life." So, yeah, the next day I wrote a theme song for Lance Bang's Life, recorded it, sent it to him, and then a couple days later I got a phone call and picked it up, and it's like, "Is this Will?" I was like, "Yeah." He's like, "Well, this is Knoxville. Here you want to be in Jackass." I was like, "Yep." And he said, "Do you want to be pranked or do you want to be a pranker?" And I said, "This is you're the boss. I'll do anything you say." And so he thankfully gave me one of the most wonderful jobs that I could have possibly asked for, which was to be an active participant in a stunt that could only happen once, which is a big, like when I first started doing any kind of performing, it was with, like, my first real performance was at the Water Tower doing improv comedy at age 9 or 10 with Walden Theater one Saturday morning, and I thought, this is the life, and thought, I'll be in the theater and this is going to be great, not realizing that most of theater isn't improv comedy. But I got to do this, intense improv comedy in which, I think probably tens, if not hundreds of thousands of dollars were invested in this single stunt. And so we had to do it right the first time, and it was high stress, high energy, and a heck of a lot of fun. Yeah.
I also wanted to ask Will about the movies. But first, I want to say I'm part of a big Van Morrison fan group, people from all over the world, and we are all very close and talk about music all the time. Van Morrison fans love you, I want you to know. I don't know if that's a connection you would have made, but
Yeah.
they do. But I wanted to ask you about A Ghost Story because I really love that movie. It's a weird little movie, the kind that I always like. And I think the central scene is that one of you in the kitchen at the party and that speech, well, the monologue you're giving. And I really thought it was great.
Yeah.
And I wondered if you had any input into that, or were you just saying the lines that the director or the writer gave you, or was that you talking?
Well, I'd love to also talk to you about Van Morrison sometime because I am interested in Van Morrison, fascinated by many things about Van Morrison as everything, as a writer, as a performer, and as a, what sounds to be like a very difficult person to spend any time with. Yeah. But actually, this new record, when I was preparing the record and talking specifically to Jacob Duncan, who plays all the horns on the record, he said, well, what should I listen to? And one of the records I said, I always tell everybody to listen to Roger Miller's A Tender Look at Love, but I said, listen also to Van Morrison's No Guru, No Method, No Teacher. And there's definitely a moment or two, specifically there's a song called Thick Air where Jacob, I think, takes that and runs with it. But in A Ghost Story, there's a long monologue that's the most dialogue, the most speaking that any character in the entire movie has, and I do it. And I think that David Lowery and Toby Hallbrooks, who made the movie, they're the writing, directing, producing team. They knew me. We'd worked together on a couple of things, including a short movie called Pioneer, in which I was given 16 pages of dialogue, or monologue essentially, to just memorize and say. And I think for all of us, that was one of the more wonderful movie-making experiences. I know it was for me, that Pioneer short movie. And so I think they had this mass of text and thought, let's throw it at Will, because they had just made a Disney movie, Pete's Dragon, and spent 2 or 3 years happily, but working under the auspices of a huge, massive, corporation with a lot of money being thrown around and a lot of decisions being made by committee. And as soon as that was over, they said, let's make our movie, and let's bring all of the people we've worked with, and let's create a story that sort of brings elements from all of our movies so far. And I was, fortunately, one of their colleagues from before, and they said, let's bring Will in, we know he can memorize the lines, and let's give him this speech. And it's not, the thing I love about acting is that I don't have to be in charge of anything. I don't have to, it's all up to everybody else in the room, including every single line that was in that monologue. It's just have to figure out how to make this sound like it makes sense, even though who knows if it made sense. But it wasn't me, it was them, yeah. Alejandra, you can ask Alanna a question.
Oh, well, there's my friend Brad. I have to call on my friend Brad.
Alanna, I was glad you alluded to Pauline Kael in Nashville earlier.
I knew this was coming.
Because I think we had this discussion 30 years ago during a radio show.
Yes.
Geraldine Chaplin played this. She played an amazing role as a journalist covering the country music scene. I think she worked for the BBC.
Yes.
It was a less than flattering portrayal.
Yes.
But she was no less enduring. And there was some rumors floating around that the role was loosely based on you. And to have Robert Altman acknowledge your genius, I just wonder.
This is totally made up. And I had a premonition you were going to ask me this. I truly did. I was on a radio show shortly after the film Nashville came out, and with one of his friends, and he called in to prank me by saying this. So he's doing this as a prank tonight. But when I saw that film, I was a little uncomfortable with that character. I did recognize some aspects of myself I didn't like. You're right. But no, not based on me. Love this guy.
Thank you both so much for
Thanks,
coming here and
Aaron.
having
Thanks
this
to the
fun
Louisville
tonight.
Free Public Library. Thanks to you all for coming.
Thank you for coming.
Thanks,
Asking
Alanna.
good questions.
And
And thank you.